Back when I was in elementary school, when it would get close to Halloween, the teachers would tell us this horror story. And I remember distinctly hearing this horror story at least for 2 or 3 years in a row. And it was basically about these older kids who back then, older kids was like 5th, 6th grade. And they had gotten their parents' permission to, for the first time, go trick-or-treating without parental supervision. And there was this one kid who wanted to trick-or-treat longer than the other kids. And when it came time for the other kids to go home, this one kid wanted to go trick-or-treating by himself. But he was never heard from again. And this is when the horror story usually got more and more creative every year. Apparently there was this family of villains, this family of demons, this family of shape-shifting non-humans who preyed on children's souls, who would move from town to town, and they would entice trick-or-treaters who were clearly by themselves and invite them into their house, and then keep them captive in their basement and torture them endlessly. And every time the teachers told us this story, the types of torture that this poor kid was suffering at the hands of these non-human demon villains was getting worse and worse. I remember reading a story a long time ago, back when they had the first housing crisis, the mortgage and loan crisis back in 2008, or leading up to it. It was this really crazy story about back in those days, when everybody was buying and selling houses because the prices of the houses were going up so much. There was this kind of weird situation that sort of fell between the cracks. This couple had decided to buy a house and then rent it out because a couple of their friends were doing the same thing. The idea is pretty compelling. You buy a house, you rent it out, the renters are paying your mortgage, and you can just sit back and watch your property values increase. And so they bought this house, and then they were kind of on the fence. Should we completely rent it out, or should we live in it ourselves? That way we can save even more money and rent out one of the rooms to somebody. And so that was what they were going to do. They're going to buy this house and then live in the house and rent out one of the rooms to help pay the mortgage. That way they would save on paying their own mortgage or save on paying their own rental, whatever else they were going to live. And so because they did all this stuff on their own and they didn't put a lot of thought into it, everything was happening so quickly, they didn't do their due diligence when they figured out who was going to rent this room from them. They just kind of used their own intuition to judge whether or not this was a good person. But before they moved into the house, when they were still trying to get out of their old place where they lived, and this guy was renting this room, the price of the house went up by like 20-30%. They paid like $600,000 for the house, and in the month where they were trying to transition, the price of the house increased by like $100,000-$200,000. So they figured, why don't we just stay in our regular place, or stay in the place we're staying now, and sell our house and make a nice fat profit. The problem was they'd already signed a rental agreement with this dude that was living in one of the rooms. So they figured, we'll just sell the house with a renter. Someone suggested this would be a selling point. You can buy this house, but this house comes with an income stream of the guy who's renting one of the rooms. And so they figured they'd do this. And because there was so much frothy behavior going on, buying and selling houses and people doing all this stuff without really crossing their T's and dotting their I's, it kind of fell through the cracks, and they didn't really figure out if this was even legal or not. So they sold the house to somebody else, and the other people moved in knowing that there was a renter there. But when they originally vetted this renter, they didn't do a very good job, and it turned out this guy was like some kind of a criminal who tried to kill the new people that bought the house. He didn't kill them, but it was a huge thing in the news, and it became this really story that was emblematic of all this frothy behavior of the last housing crisis. I watched this interesting podcast, or rather, I listened to this interesting podcast the other night by a psychiatrist, a psychologist, who has a very interesting take on how to heal her patients. And she said a lot of psychologists, a lot of therapists recognize the need to work within the metaphor of the patient that comes with the problem. But most, if not all, therapists feel this kind of instinctive need, this instinctive hierarchical superiority. I'm the therapist, you're the patient, you need to do what I say. They feel a need based on this relative status to get them to leave their metaphor behind and accept reality. But her idea was that all of reality is really just a metaphor. Everybody tells themselves stories, and it doesn't matter what story you tell yourself. It's whether or not the story is keeping you on the sidelines or your stories that you tell yourself help you get into the game. Her idea is that everybody has these instinctively programmed desires. Everybody wants to become a better relationship partner. Everybody wants to develop more skills to build more relationships. Everybody wants to make more money. Everybody wants to become more socially outgoing. But the question is, do the stories you tell yourself help you do these things? Or do the stories you tell yourself keep you on the sidelines? And she saw everybody in terms of this dichotomy. Is this person a sideline dweller, or is this person in the game? If this person's in the game, then they come to see the psychiatrist, this psychologist, so they can do better in the game, so they can take what's working and figure out ways to do it better. But if they come from a sideline perspective, even though they probably don't recognize they're on the sidelines, she sees it as her job to get them off the sidelines and in the game. It's kind of like knowing that if somebody is hungry, they need to eat. You don't need to convince them why they need to eat, but because you know that eating is an instinctively necessary thing. Because you know that eating is an instinctively pleasurable thing. Getting somebody to eat will satisfy their needs in some way. And so she sees herself as helping people get into the game of life, which is essentially figuring out ways to get more of the instinctively desirous things, instinctively desirable things, better relationships, more money, better responsibilities, higher responsibilities, better status at work, better recognition from your peers for things that you do to satisfy their instinctive needs. And to get that outcome, to serve those needs, to understand this pattern, she works within the metaphors of her patients without ever needing to break the metaphors of her patients. And this whole podcast was a lot of examples of how she did this. Like somebody comes to them who's clearly on the sidelines, and their story is that they've got these demons following them around. And these demons are everywhere, keeping them stuck, keeping them from afraid, making them afraid to talk to other people, making them afraid to approach other people, and they believe they literally see demons. So instead of convincing them that there's no such thing as demons and getting in the game, that would be too complex for their brain. She discovered that it's a lot easier to work within their story, to work within their metaphor, and just change it a little bit. So the same story that kept them on the sidelines is the same story that can propel them into the game. So they can get into the game and get more good stuff out of life. And so they would do all this demonology-based hypnotic techniques. She would take whatever hypnotic methods that would solve them if they didn't have such a convoluted story and just translate that into the language of the metaphor. And so they would have these exorcisms, they would have these kind of rituals, and they would slowly replace the demons everywhere with angels. And so this person on the sidelines would be trapped by demons. But once they would replace demons with angels, and they started to see angels everywhere, and they started to hear angel voices giving them advice on how to get in the game and get more good stuff out of life, that would transition them off the sidelines into the game because they had changed the demons with angels. Another case study she shared was with someone who believed they'd been abducted by aliens, and they had an alien brain chip in their head. And this alien brain chip was keeping them stuck. This alien brain chip was causing anxiety. This alien brain chip was keeping them from feeling the feelings they wanted to feel so they could get into the game. And so they did a lot of hypnotic storytelling techniques down deep beneath the metaphor, underneath the metaphor, within the language of the metaphor. And so they would have these kind of sessions where they would get in a deep hypnotic trance state and commune with the aliens and negotiate with the aliens and talk to the aliens and tell the aliens that they made a mistake and they put the wrong brain chip in their head. And with their new brain chip, they would get signals from the aliens secretly giving them advice, telling them what to say to people, telling them how to behave around people, giving them a jolt of confidence from this alien brain chip so they could get in the game and build more relationships, so they could get in the game and become a more persuasive communicator, so they could get in the game and live life much more robustly and get off the sidelines. It was a fascinating interview, and she was saying this is what happens when you when you get rid of your ego, and your need to tell people what to do and just work within their mental maps. Because if you get rid of your ego temporarily and work within other people's mental maps, it's amazing the things you can get them to do. It's amazing the things you can persuade them to do. It's amazing the things you can get them to see out in the world through their own metaphors, through their own mental maps, through their own ideas, which will help them to become incredibly successful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.